Welcome to season 4. We have a very special guest on tonight to talk with us about the pairings of things that should never have been divided. I had a different sort of intro to start with here. One, thank you all for joining us here on season 4 on Mosaic Ark. We are going to be bringing you in this new year more interviews, more thoughts about philosophy, theology, and mythology, more cultural commentary, some, thoughts on books and films and stuff. And oh, yes, we are making playlists so that you can follow in all of these different themes that we here on the Mosaic Ark are proud to bring you. One of our ongoing themes is, of course, the interplay between, well, I don't know, what some call science and others call religion, when actually, if you're a medievalist, you should recognize that they're not two of the same things. They're both, there's scientia and sapientia are both aspects of contemplation of the divine. But we here in modernity or post-modernity or whatever we are now in the digital age have lost that feeling of connection with the world that we live in, with the magnificent creature that we are creatures participating in. And so it is entirely appropriate that for our opening episode of season 4, because of course we start new seasons in August, right? That's a summertime celebration on our part. We have a scientist here to explain why all the scientists are getting it wrong. Welcome to the Mosaic Ark. Are you happy that season 4? Can you believe we've done 3 whole years of Mosaic Ark? There should be some, sort of symbolic something or other at going to 4. 4 will gain stability after we've been in the 1 of unity and the 2 of duality and conflict, and in the 3 of mystery and mythology. And now here we are in 4. Maybe we'll finally become visible. That would be good.
Graduation after this year.
Something like that. I don't know. I mean, Hans is our old friend, and so we're just going to start talking in the middle of things because he follows us in the middle of things. And Hans, we're very happy to have you back to talk to us more about what those scientists are getting up to. You have a new book, I hear.
Yes, I do. Thank you for letting me join you in kicking off your season 4 and talk about my books. Sadly, the version I have doesn't look as pretty as the one that is actually on the Kickstarter, because this is the earlier cover design. Yeah. But that is available, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk a little bit about the fundamentals and origins of electromagnetism while we are probing medieval science.
Well, that's a large promise there, right? So all I wanted to do was say, yay, we're in season 4 now. But one of the things we've been doing, which Hans is somewhat aware of because he sometimes hangs out with us ladies when we've been writing lines. Not for a while, though. We've kept our secret. Thinking about, I mean, alchemy is a big layer of what we've been thinking about, some of which involves some mathematics. And a lot of it involves a lot of material science. And so unbeknownst to you, and you kind of were warned that whatever we're going to talk about with medieval tonight, understand that our thinking, thanks to all this reading we've been doing about paint, is particularly in respect to material science, very much in flux right now. So it's actually a great time for you to come on. But in all fairness, we would have more questions for you than, well, anyway.
And I would have more questions than anybody because I'm really out of my element here between the two of you. So I'm just going to be a student of like every subject that's going to be discussed tonight, and medieval science and alchemy and paint and art and architecture and history and theology all tends to mix together in the topic of, well, today it's been distilled down to science, but from what I understand, it's all the same thing in the Middle Ages, right?
Much more coherent. So because the Hans, just in the background of a lot of what we've been reading a lot by an art conservator, Spike Bucklow, who's written a wonderful series of books on the alchemy of color. And of course, since he's actually an art conservator, he's thinking very much about the physical properties of the pigments that he's using. But because he's got the bug to do the proper medieval alchemical understanding of everything, also all of these pigments and materials have spiritual effects. And then what you end up with, and this is sort of where the Franciscans that you've been asking me about come in, that none of these things are separable, right? It's like the physical world feeds into our spiritual experiences. And, for example, one of the things that I learned from his book that I was looking at today has to do with Nicholas of Cusa's negative mysticism. Don't worry, I haven't read any of it yet either. But one of the interesting things I learned immediately about Nicholas of Cusa is he has a sort of mathematical theology, which apparently not only were people like Johannes Kepler and John Dee and Athanasius Kircher really interested in, but also like guys like Leibniz, right? So I think, if one of the things that we're doing in the sort of long sort of practice that we're gaining here, getting into the mysteries of how to do science and how to do theology and twinning them in poetry, is recovering some of the lost possibilities of this tradition that were, as we've been learning in Act 4 that we're writing them in Draco Alchemicus, were badly fractured in the 17th century. And Hans, you've already been on. The guys, you can look back in the archive. We're doing a bit of indexing so everybody can find the things that we had done in our past episodes. But Hans talked to us about Bacon, Francis Bacon, about a year and a half ago, I think. And so what we get tonight is sort of the backstory on why Bacon matters, because of the science that, in fact, Bacon comes in and disrupts, right? So is that a proper framing for what we can show tonight? You gave me your entire slide deck, and there's no way with us ladies on board you're going to get through all 45 of these slides. Although I'm aware there's some, like, if you need to know about his Kickstarter and his book and stuff, there's some at the end. So we'll definitely show you those. But maybe if we just plunge in to the introduction that you have for us, and we'll see where it takes us.
Sure.
Is that good? Okay. So I have hopefully Let There Be Light. Well, okay. Good start already. From gross test to Bacon. And this is Hans speaking from the Society for Post-Quantum Research, LLC. You've got to explain what that is. The SPQR. I sense a pun. You may begin.
I'm not going to get any of these jokes, but go on.
Yeah, well, okay. It's like, if you've been in Rome, the SPQR is on all of the manholes.
No.
And
okay.
and in fun places like the signs in the park, which says, no ball playing. Don't jump on the plants or have ball games. SPQR, right? I'm not sure that's what Hans means.
Well, I thought that since my approach to quantum mechanics is recapitulating a classical approach, what better way to symbolize that than by having the classical motif of SPQR being the blanket organization under which I'm doing all of this. So that was the motivation behind the Roman themed logo.
Right, in case he still doesn't know what it means.
No.
This is when you gave
I
me
mean-
this stack of slides, and he's like, we'll work through all these. I'm like, not in your
Yeah.
life.
I haven't seen the slide. I haven't even seen the slides, and it's like I'm here so that other people watching can relate to me and go, huh? What?
What?
So that's my function tonight. I'll try not to interrupt too much.
No,
Sorry.
I'm going to read the slides, and then you'll have to ask the questions. That this is one of the things that Hans is wanting to do in his project is help people like us who I think I have bragged before about my absolute failing practical exam in electricity and magnetism in freshman year in physics. I could not answer anything. Well, I thought I was going to do fine on it because they were easy problems, and I'd done all the the lab reports. But my lab partner, nice young man, had done all the circuit hookups, and literally nothing. When I was there by myself trying to hook up circuits to test resistance and stuff like that, literally nothing would work. I mean, I understood things well enough to know it was all wrong, but for the life of me, I couldn't figure out how to make it all happen, right? So if I'm now obsessed with the practicality of how do we make this stuff work, this is why I'm still trying to figure out. We still haven't told them what SPQR is. Come on, Hans, tell them what SPQR means. No, it's a classical thing. It's this mysterious anagram that means eagles.
Well, it means for the Senate and people of Rome.
Oh, very good. So you're claiming governmental power behind your work here?
At least over this new version of what ultimately will be quantum mechanics that I'm working on.
The Senate and people of quantum research. Wait, no.
The
Society for Post-Quantum Research. Yes, which will now rule the world. I do think, so if I'd really been prepping properly for this stream, I would have grabbed your video off your crowdfund at Fund My Comic, and have played it. But guys, you got to look at I kept you promised to do all sorts of things, like be our Sherpa in the climbing the mountain of electromagnetism, which sounded great, but you didn't say what we were going to be able to do other than understand cool stuff. Are we getting wizard powers here? We need to know right from the outset.
Oh, you'll gain a whole brand new worldview of how reality works. That's what I'm promising you.
This does not sound alchemical enough. I want to be able to work on matter and transform, the reality with this knowledge. Is it not going to do that? Okay. So you will transform us into wizards eventually, with fire thunderbolts and eagles in their atomic structures. But right now we need to know this because
we're all curious about understanding the world and how it works.
Okay, this is sounding more medieval by the second. So this is contemplation, is what you're saying.
Right.
I don't buy it, because the other thing I noticed in your trailer video was how you talked about how you came to this to be writing this book.
Mm-hmm. Well, I came to be writing this book because I sat down for dinner with some mutual friends, science fiction grandmaster John C. Wright and his wife L. Jaji Lamplighter Wright, and just talking about how I was kind of frustrated at how difficult it was to explain my ideas and get professional support and feedback and so forth, and
government money. You don't work for
that too.
Money.
And they asked, well, what is this idea of yours? And I explained it to them. Took 10, 15 minutes, and they got it. And that was when the light bulb turned on for me, and I realized it wasn't that I had an esoteric idea that was so complicated that professional physicists and engineers couldn't understand it. It's really very simple. And the only thing that's preventing the professionals from understanding it is the fact that they've accepted the premises underlying the conventional view, and it's just too hard to get out of the rut and consider a completely new and different perspective, something that's relatively easy to do for someone who hasn't been trained in that perspective.
So you are, in fact, doing the same thing we are on the Mosaic Ark, which is we are trying to show people a frame for understanding reality that from within makes perfect sense and from without sounds crazy.
That's a good way to describe it.
But the thing is that it's I mean, you and I have talked a lot in person about your project, and most of the time when you explain it to me, I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm not sure I can follow the mathematics because I never figured out how to do those circuits in physics lab. But what you've described makes a lot of sense. So, can you give us the short version that you gave John and Jaji?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Well, I think it's important to start by understanding the conventional perspective,
Okay.
so that you can contrast my approach to it. In conventional thinking, electromagnetism is due to one thing, a photon, which somehow combines the mutually contradictory properties of being a non-local wave and a localized particle at the same time. And in conventional thinking, if you take a charge and you wiggle that charge around, it spits out this photon, which propagates unperturbed from that moment of emission off to wherever it's going to be received or absorbed. And that's the conventional thinking of electromagnetism. Well, in my perspective, electromagnetism isn't due to one thing that combines two mutually contradictory properties. Instead, it's due to two things: fields and energy. Fields that behave like non-localized waves, and energy that in the quantum limit behaves like particles. And as you go through and take a look at any number of different electromagnetic systems, what you discover is that the fields go one way and the energy goes a different way. They're on different trajectories. They're doing different things. They have to be different phenomena. They can't be, two manifestations of the same thing, because they're going in different directions and doing different things. And if you take a look at, just to give one example of how radiation works, we know, for instance, it doesn't make sense to talk about the sound of one hand clapping, because it takes two hands to make clapping work. Well, physicists they rely on a model of radiation that assumes you can have one charge accelerate, and that's not how it works. You have to have at least two charges in order to have acceleration, because that accelerating charge needs another charge to cause the acceleration. They have to work together to make it happen. Or you have to have a bunch of charges distributed like on a parallel plate capacitor in order to make a charge accelerate. So by their tendency to reductionism, they're trying to reduce everything to a single charge and a single photon and explain it that way. And the explanation fails. It breaks down into contradiction.
Can I interrupt and ask, why do they assume anything?
Sure.
Why do they assume anything?
Well, that's the picture that they have of how it works. And it goes back to some physical thinking. It's actually a 19th century model of electromagnetism. Physicists treat radiation as being a kinked field line. They assume that if we have a single charge, it has its field lines going radially outward from that charge. And then if we move it, we get a sideways or transverse component in the field line that ripples out at the speed of light. And that they think is radiation. But that's a really bad model, because radiation fields always form closed loops. And in that model, which was originally pioneered by Heaviside and by J.J. Thomson, in that model, there's no radiation. Field lines are unterminated. They don't form closed loops. It's a really bad model of radiation if your field lines don't close and form closed loops, because that suggests you've got charges floating.
How did they come up with this theory? It's not observed, right?
It's a direct consequence of our understanding of electromagnetism and how it works. So, Heaviside was able to come up with this model, before, actually about not long after Hertz made the very first measurements of radio waves. It was just taking the equations and looking at their consequences. And that's kind of the implicit model that has been used ever since for over 100 years for people to visualize and understand electromagnetism.
So they just extrapolated it to other areas from that observed, I guess, wave.
Right. Well, one of the key problems is that back, say, in World War II, physicists and engineers used the same textbook. In fact, the common textbook was one by Julius Adams Stratton, Electromagnetic Theory. So the physicists on the Manhattan Project and the electrical engineers building radars at the radiation lab at MIT, they were, both sets were using the same book. But then after World War II, the field kind of split, and physicists stopped talking to engineers. We just kind of assumed that, well, we know all of this electromagnetism stuff. We're going to go on to particle theory and nuclear physics and so forth. And a consequence of that is I can take a look at the textbook that I learned electromagnetism from for my physics PhD program. It's the same textbook, I think one edition further, that's still used today and is the most prominent textbook. And if you take a look at the applied electromagnetic topics in that textbook, it's a dumbed down, streamlined version of the topics that were in Stratton 80 years ago. Arguably, today's physicists are less well-informed and less well-trained about applied electromagnetism than their predecessors of 80 years ago.
That seems crazy. Why would you do that to your own field? I mean, as a publisher of these, not you, but the publishers of these textbooks, why would they do that?
Well, because the people who write the physics textbooks are physics teachers, and they're not the antenna or microwave or wireless engineers who are having to solve those kinds of practical real world problems. So they don't include them. They're more interested in the problems involved in the radiation you get from very high acceleration of charges on particle accelerator beam lines. They've got lots of stuff about how to look at the radiation from particle accelerators, but very little on how to understand things like antennas or transmission lines.
So this is, I think we've got several open parentheses here, but this is the thing I noticed in your video, that you came to this because you said, I've been working on making things. I've been working on making the antennae, right. And your sense of it's like this fits with our alchemical studies, right? One of the things Bucklow says about the making the pigments and such, artists used to have to make their own pigments, and so they knew things about the materials because they had to actually grind up the rocks, and they had to process the lead. You get white from burying lead and urine and dung and leaving it there for 40 days, right? And you get a rust off of the lead. It's the white paint, right? And you would know all of these things. You wouldn't go to the shop and buy a tube of it. You'd have to be able to work with the materials themselves. And that you came to your new theoretical understanding based on the work that you had actually been doing in designing the antennae. So it's craft skills.
Exactly.
I mean, this seems to me like if you want to know why aren't we as smart as the people in the Middle Ages anymore? We've lost all the craft skills.
Yeah, if you're not doing something with it, you're not going to get it.
We're not actually
improve it.
And so everything that we've been talking about in the last few weeks about art and the AI and worrying about that and such, the more we have these robots doing the things that should be things that we do with our own bodies, the less we're going to understand. It's or be able to have insight about. It's a contemplation we think of as this thing that's abstracted and just understanding, but in fact if you don't actually do it with your body, you don't understand anything.
Right. And a lot of the key technology was developed during World War II and immediately thereafter, and it's things that weren't in Stratton, so the physicists of the day didn't learn it, and they haven't gone back to include it in their treatment of the subject. So, for instance, ham radio operators are used to the concept of a voltage standing wave ratio on a transmission line. And what happens is if you send a signal down a transmission line, if there is a discontinuity in the impedance, so if the nature of the transmission line changes, say when you are connecting it to an antenna and the signals are flowing into the antenna, well, you'll get a reflection coming back. So you have a forward and a reverse wave on the transmission line interfering with each other. And you'll get, instead of the balance of electric and magnetic energy that characterizes an electromagnetic wave moving at the speed of light, at least in the medium or for the geometry of the transmission line, instead of that, you get the energy slowing down and oscillating back and forth. In the limit where the forward and reverse wave are equal and opposite, the energy just kind of oscillates back and forth, and there's no net energy flow. So trying to explain that in terms of a photon that supposedly doesn't interact with anything from the transmitter as it's going through there, I mean, it's basically arguing that somehow the forward photons and the reverse photons are propagating past each other and not interacting whatsoever, and nevertheless yielding these macroscopic effects. But because those macroscopic effects aren't anything that physicists worry about, they don't feel the shoe pinch and don't really have any reason or incentive to take a look at it and ask what's going on here, and maybe my model.
But you're describing an astounding lack of curiosity on the part of that particular field. I'm kind of surprised.
Well, there's an awful lot to learn, and you can't know everything, and that's part of the problem with textbooks in general, because what will happen with textbooks is a professor writes a textbook, he takes the material that was in the textbooks that he learned from, emphasizes the stuff that he used professionally, can't fit everything, so cuts out the stuff that's extraneous or that he doesn't think is important. And over a few generations, a lot of old material gets lost and forgotten.
That's the same thing they accused
to me.
the philosophers during the 17th century because they read Aristotle too much. Like you haven't experimentally tested all of these assumptions that you have about the way in which motion and the qualities of materials and things like that. You all don't know anything because you're just relying on your theory all the time. Ha 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 ha. You've just pulled. Talk about medieval, right? So you're saying that modern physicists and in particular perhaps other scientists too who are not engaged in the actual engineering and practical craft are working just like the quote scientific revolution accused the Aristotelians of doing.
Well, people forget stuff that they don't use is the
makes sense.
Fundamental issue.
What I'm wondering about is now okay, so what you described the ham operators, that does fit with your understanding, and that they are because they need the materials to work in a particular way in order to have the effect of being able to transmit sound in whatever mode that's happening. It's I'm thinking it's like for Bucklow with the you can make the color, and like for example he has one color that came from a particular kind of red berry, which when you put the dye on the surface, right, that you're painting, it's originally red but then immediately turns green, or maybe it goes the other way around. And that he said nobody ever described it because they all knew that that's the way you did it, right? So there's craft knowledge in the practice that somehow doesn't make it into the written version of things. You don't write all your craft skills down, and two is dismissed or forgotten by the people who are busy theorizing on everything. So what you're basically saying is that the modern scientists are doing exactly what they love, ridiculing what they think the medieval scientists were doing.
Very much so. It's a fascinating issue because I can give you an example. The very first antennas, well, of course, Hertz did experimentation with a variety of antennas, including reflectors and dipoles and so forth. But some of the first practical antennas were invented by an English physicist named Oliver Lodge. And he invented what we would now call a biconical antenna, basically two cones that are fed from the tips of the cones close to each other and then flare out from that feed point, and a planar version of that he called a bow tie antenna, where the cones are replaced by planar triangular elements. Well, those are excellent ultra-wideband antennas, and they worked well with spark gap technology, where people build a big voltage and send a spark to the system, and it would kind of ring down. It would have very broad bandwidth, and generally only one person could transmit in an area at a time. Now, they knew that they could have a lot more channels if they could fix signals on frequencies, but the spark gap technology could not support precise frequency control. Well, eventually they developed transmitters that could support precise frequency control, and they no longer needed the biconical antennas. They went to thin wire antennas instead. And then, of course, that was in the 1890s that Lodge did that work. In the 1930s, the state of the art of wireless technology progressed to the point where people were starting to work with frequencies as high as maybe 30 megahertz and wavelengths like 10 meters or so. And it started to get practical again to build these ultra wideband antenna elements. And in fact, people had completely forgotten about the biconical antenna. An RCA engineer, Philip Carter, I think it was in 34, maybe it was 32, the early 1930s, he reinvented the biconical antenna, submitted a patent to the patent office. The examiners had never heard of it either and gave him the patent. The second time that the USPTO had patented the biconical antenna. And in fact, there was another engineer who similarly came across the design and was about to file a patent. Only his attorney was familiar with that ancient forgotten literature from Oliver Lodge and was able to say, no, that's been done before. Don't try to invent that. So there was this whole section of the art of antenna design that was forgotten from about 1900 to about 1930, about a generation where all the engineers in the 1930s, they weren't really intimately familiar with what was going on in the 1890s. So they forgot all about it. There was work being done with horn antennas, and in fact, even millimeter wave, very short wave signals in the 1890s. And that was forgotten also. And all those horn antenna designs were rediscovered during World War II. So there's these cycles where technologists forget what came before because it hasn't been useful for a generation or two, and rediscover it and then advance the art further. And that's happened time and again as I've studied the art of antenna design.
Yeah, I'm starting to understand why people are surprised when they hear people from NASA say, well, we don't have that technology anymore. It's it's like, it's not necessarily nefarious. Maybe this is just the way, engineers and scientists have been working for 100 years.
And anyone who has ever been involved in actually building an electronic device has no problem accepting that, NASA's completely forgotten that and has lost the technology.
That's clearly what happened to me in my physics lab. But the thing is, it's Hans, I was actually serious when I asked you, like, what do you hope people get out of the book, right? Because one of the things that we're learning from reading about the alchemy and the paint and such, and that I have been very committed to in my learning defense and things like that, is there's certain kinds of things that you can only know by doing. You can watch people apparently performing them, fencing, but have no clue whatsoever about how to do them. And Bucklow very nicely says this is what the guilds called craft mysteries, right? They're not mysteries because nobody knows them. They're mysteries because the only way you can have them is to train in them. And from your own experience in working with the antenna, and you had some pictures in the video of your I'm assuming those are yours, the flat discs. And now what you're talking about, it's like books can't capture everything. Not to discourage you in writing the book, right? but this is it's a prejudice that we have, us literate people, right? And it's been a conceit in the bad sense since certainly since the Enlightenment with Diderot, and he's going to, get his encyclopedia, and he's going to get all the craft knowledge, and he's going to put diagrams and write it down in his encyclopedia, and then everybody will have access to all these crafts. And then, in fact, no, they don't, because there's things that you can only understand. I mean, just embodied, right? The only way you can understand it is if you're actually working with the materials that the world teaches us through its matter, not just through this sort of contemplative abstraction that, Platonic philosophers have always loved, but Aristotelians know is missing something of the knowledge that you have.
Well, it's very simple. I mean, you're a body and a mind and a spirit. You can't be just a robot with no mind and immediately know how to do things, or just have a mind and contemplate it and say, I'm going to whip up a souffle. I've read an article. Now I can do it. Yeah. Way different when it's
Right.
hands-on and you're whisk. What does that mean?
Well, that is one of the key themes of my book, because I take a look at the difference between that Aristotelian and Platonic approach. Plato mastered and advocated a deductive approach to knowledge, where he would take a look at premises and fundamental principles and work out their consequences. The Aristotelian approach is to take a look at facts and observations, and through a process of induction, come up with what are the fundamental principles. So what you're talking about is basically, in my career doing antenna design, doing the near field electromagnetic ranging systems, that exposed me to a wide range of facts about electromagnetism and how it worked. And I took that experience base and then generated these principles. And it's those principles really that I'm sharing in my book on fields and energy. So I'm talking about the fundamental principles. I'm not talking about, hey, if you want to make an antenna, you pull out the tin snips and your copper foil and you watch the return loss on your vector network analyzer as you snip it into the shape you want. I do talk about that kind of thing in my book on the art and science of ultra-wideband antenna design. But that's going into a combination of both the theory and some of the technique and practice involved in doing those antenna designs. The field and energy book, though, it is more about the conclusions and the principles that I have derived as a result of that practical experience.
Okay, so this is to beg the question. Then what? I mean, because obviously this is my life, right? I write this kind of book too, right? It's like, here's this practice that people are involved in, say prayer, for example, and now I'm going to write a something of it, and it's been very frustrating for me, because I say the kinds of things that people describe as effects of their practices, or we just keep on the paint example with Bucklow saying, you see particular colors in a painting, and most art historians have typically been drawn to describe them as their symbolism, right? You choose these colors because they have symbolic significance. But Bucklow is saying, well, they actually, the symbolic significance that the painters would have known they had was because they knew how to make the paints. But all of that gets lost once you're just looking at the object. And that the sense of, on the one hand, you're not writing a book that is for people who can't pass their physics lab because they couldn't figure out how to connect the connectors correctly to get it across the resistor ohm thing and make it go on the oscilloscope and everything. So for whom are you writing, so that we can have an understanding of what kind of audience are you imagining being delighted? Because I think what you want is delight from this book.
Well, I'm aiming for the curious student who wants to have insight about the subject matter that they're embarking on studying. I'm also writing for the layperson who just wants to know more about physics and how it works in an accessible fashion, and also for the professional who wants to have these insights to guide their professional work. That's less of it will be useful to professionals. I think it will be harder for professionals to really hop out of their current mode of thinking and appreciate the different model I
How do
have
you
to
think
offer.
how
But it's
how do
those
you think
three
it will change the
audiences.
professional's practice?
Well, it provides an alternate way of looking at how electromagnetism works that you can bring to solve difficult problems. And I
Mm.
present some examples of some of those problems that I had to tackle in my practice, and how the conventional perspective just doesn't make sense, but my approach does and helps solve the problem.
See, this is so I think some part of the problem of science is you could have a completely wrong theory about why stuff works, right? For example, a lot of the ways that Bucklow tries to describe the way the paints are made, he says, well, we might describe it as a way of these processes of these particular chemical reactions, but their version of why things worked would be because of the qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry, and the way those interact. And so if you're going to make the blue from the lapis lazuli, you first have to make it you make a paste ball that then you bleach out, not bleach out, but sort of the blue falls out. And their descriptions of Ciannini's descriptions of how they make these pigments rely on a completely other theory of why the elements would have the
Right.
interactions that they do. And yet the paint works, right? It's like you get the paint. Whereas now, you might, for an industrial production of, well, lapis is still it's a precious stone, but you might describe it differently, but get exactly the same result. Do you see the situation? So the description can be on the basis of completely different understanding of the material world, and yet still have the physical, technical craft product that you were aiming at.
Oh, we see that all the time in physics. The classic example that ties into our medieval discussion is the Ptolemaic model of the solar system, and taking the motions of the planets and breaking them down into epicycles and deferents, basically superimposing these circular motions. Medieval scientists had the assumption that, from Aristotle, that heavenly motion is perfect and therefore circular, and terrestrial motion is not perfect and is linear, and therefore all the planets have to move in circles and superpositions of circles. And sure enough, if you add up enough circles, you can match and successfully predict where the planets are going to be in the sky. In fact, it was even extended into understanding projectile motion. They had what was called the three-part method for understanding projectile motion, where if you shoot a cannonball, for instance, it travels linearly out of the cannon, and then if it gets high enough, it gets close enough to the heavens to start having a circular trajectory to bring it back down. Then it's come back down, and it has a linear trajectory as it comes back to Earth. Now, of course, that doesn't quite match reality, in which the cannonball's trajectory is really parabolic instead of lines with a circular arc connecting them. But it was a good enough approximation for a lot of purposes, and a lot of the medieval artillerymen would use that three-part method for doing their calculations and do a pretty decent job of it.
So what I hear is you need the physics to make military decisions.
In that case,
any
yes.
other, right? This is I'm playing devil's advocate on all of this, right? And it's like what difference does it make whether we have the right model of the way the planets move? If we're the reason that they have astronomy and in the ancient tradition is to be able to tell time, right? It's the knowing where you are in the cycle of the seasons and the movement of the stars. It doesn't actually change anything on Earth. So it's purely contemplative, because in the pre-17th century understanding, the heavens are immutable and perfect and in their movements, and so you're contemplating those because it's the unchanging, except for the movement, which has changed, but the unchanging versus the changeable under the sublunary sphere, right? So that we live in the region of mutability and transformation and decay, whereas the celestial is perfect and beautiful. And you consider, alchemically and contemplatively the interaction between these two, but how does it change our lives if we're not Elon Musk, if we don't
Well,
know where Mars is?
well, don't forget, we need to know where Mars is to successfully cast a horoscope for our sovereign, who is paying us good money as
Oh, well,
court
yes, we have
astrologer.
talked about that. That you need to be able. The astrolabes were sold to doctors, right? 'Cause you're contemplating the heavens to know when to do bloodletting. Yes, that's fair. But the thing is, if in fact you can do that predictively, irrelevant of the model that you have in your head of the stars. It's like what Galileo does with the telescope is, of course, make everyone suspicious of their senses.
Well, keep in mind, a knowledge of astronomy was of utility for navigation. Also, people would be able to calculate their latitude using a sextant, figure out where they are. How far above the horizon is Polaris, so they could tell what their latitude is. And then, of course, the big challenge was solving the longitude, which required accurate clocks, which really you had to wait until about the 18th century
Huygens clock. Yeah, you
to
have
crack
the
that problem.
Huygens. Okay, we actually have a proper question. Leslie Boom asks, Hans, my father is a retired electrical engineer research professor, specializing in power distribution. How might you anticipate he would receive your work generally, and this book specifically? So, an electrical engineer in power distribution.
This book, this first book does not go. I mean, the first book is on the fundamentals and origins of electromagnetism. So it's really mostly history and presenting the basic model. But one of the things that is underappreciated and that I emphasize, I have to wait for the third book to see it, although I can ping me on Twitter and I can shoot you some references that he might want to read. But it turns out that energy flow near antennas has a lot of similarities to the kind of energy flow that you worry about as a power engineer. Power engineers look at energy going down transmission lines, and they talk about things like the power factor that tells you how much real forward power you have versus reactive power just oscillating back and forth on your line. And an electrically small antenna behaves the same way. In fact, what I did was take the expressions for the fields around a small antenna and plot their impedances on a Smith chart. And that's the kind of yin-yang symbol that you see in the little logo hiding behind the eagle in the SPQR. I called it the Shelkonoff-Smith chart, and explain exactly what the analogy is between radiation from a small antenna and the power factor that power engineers are used to. So I think he might appreciate my approach to looking at radiation and the analogies and similarities I draw to conventional power engineering, and how the power factor and the quality factor relate to the antenna performance.
Okay.
So that's a recommend.
Well, no, I'm enjoying sort of pushing you back on the that we need things that your frustration of science is similar to my frustration with history in the sense of how we explain the things that are working, and that we as experimenters, ironically, right, you were saying the experiments have gotten away from the actual experiment. The modern science has been moving. Well, so I was listening to Tucker Carlson talk to the Economist.
Oh yes, that was an excellent
Werner,
discussion.
yes.
Werner.
And he's saying, nobody ever tested this stuff, right? It's like suddenly the economists can't explain anything because they never put banks in their models. And if you put the banks in and understand the alchemical effects of banking, and creating money and things like that, suddenly all of these things, but that they were the macroeconomics economists were so fixed on their model, they weren't including effects of things that they thought, oh well, that doesn't actually have a relevance to this system.
The thing that I found particularly interesting is clearly the bankers do include banks in their
They're
models,
on
and they're
the
just
board
not
of the banks.
telling anyone.
Yes,
Right.
so they're the wizards keeping secrets about exactly how that gold is
how the
is
economy
coming out
works
of
and how they're
nowhere.
manipulating it.
Right? Yes.
The picture of how the central banks deliberately sabotaged the Japanese economy, and the fact that they're doing more or less the same thing right now to us, or at least trying to, that was eye-opening. It's one of the most significant podcasts I've listened to in the last couple of years, and
I'm going to listen to it. I haven't listened to it yet, but is it going to make me depressed for the next 2 days or angry, or both?
A little bit of both, maybe, but it's good to know and to understand what's going on there, because there is a message of hope in that about how you can create growth by having a distributed banking system with lots of small banks that can be responsive and get capital in the hands of the small entrepreneurs who are responsible for a large part of the growth.
Which was a thing 100 years ago in this country, was it not?
And we're working very hard to crush it and kill it by centralizing our banking.
Lots of little banks are the way that the local growth can happen, and the centralizing is the way they suck all the wealth out of the country, which is another 17th century effect, because when they invent the Bank of England and do so in the practice that they've picked up from the goldsmith, and this is all in fact in Neil Stephenson's Baroque cycle. Right? Oh. Which is, I mean, exactly all the stuff Werner was talking about, the way the bankers invent the credit by way of keeping hold of the gold. Stevenson was pointing to a lot of this stuff in his that was in Quicksilver in the first one, where the goldsmiths are worrying about whether the gold's all gonna melt when the city catches fire. I think it did. Anyway, it's so what we're finding out is the 17th century is absolutely key for understanding all these things, but we're also finding out that more was lost in the invention of new ways of thinking and deceptions that are coming out of the 17th century than we've appreciated. And this is where Hans has been anxious to get the medieval part right. So let's carry on now. We've got Let There Be Light. That we have. Okay, this is an overly ambitious exercise for tonight, but in the sense that we wanted to talk about the Dark Ages and the medieval foundations of physics, and go through some of the things that Hans has learned because of things that I gave him to read about the Franciscans and the Dominicans. Less that there's way more to know about the Franciscans and the Dominicans, guys. This is more like giving you new historical exercises as well as physical exercises. But to understand this, we first have to go with this graph that is a complete misleading claim about the hole left by the Christian Dark Ages.
I figured that would provoke some conversation.
Yawn. I mean, this is what I also tried to explain to you, that medievalists have not believed this forever, right? The number of times that I've had to correct working scientists now on, when everybody thought the world was flat, and I'm like, yeah, yesterday. That's a modern fantasy about how stupid people were in the past about their science, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
But you clearly keep encountering it too, because you keep asking me about it, and it's like, it never happened.
Well, the quotes that I provide, historians of science have piled on to replicate that. I think that was a very common interpretation, at least in the 19th century. You see William Whewell, who was a very famous, in fact, he's the guy who coined the term science and scientists.
The actual term scientist?
He wrote a class. Yeah, he's the guy who coined the term. So he wrote The History of the Inductive Sciences, which is an excellent resource for understanding the history of science, at least up to that point. And of course, he said that You didn't have to worry about what was going on in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries because at the end it was the same as at the beginning and no progress was made. And you have Ivor B. Hart, who wrote Makers of Science, similarly saying that there's nothing there. It's ignorance, it's misunderstanding. They're repeating that Renaissance Enlightenment
This is
talking
lazy.
point that everyone was ignorant until we came along, and now we're going to shake things up and change things with our Renaissance and Enlightenment ideals.
It still gets repeated, today. It's just lazy. It's lazy scholarship.
It's also because they can't see, right? It's the framing problem. That if Hoyle, who I say his names look like Waywell, but anyway, if he thinks nobody in the Middle Ages was thinking in the way that I think is important, and it's like he's reframed the question in a way that he can't. I mean, it's like he's definitely blind to the technological advances that took place in the Middle Ages, without which he probably couldn't even see to write his book. For example, eyeglasses.
Yeah.
Right. And that's one of the great challenges of looking at medieval science, because of course there's a temptation to take our modern understanding of concepts like optics or the light propagation and imposing that on the writings of the period, and presuming that they had a greater understanding than they really did, or they meant something other than what they did. If you go to slide 5 there, the chart of the manuscript
that's
growth.
Slide 6, I think. 5. No, it's 5. You're right. It's 5.
Is it 6?
It's got the plague guy in the plague mask on it. Okay.
Oh yeah. So the idea there is if you try to take a look at the growth of knowledge and you use as a metric the output of manuscripts, you see that nice exponential curve that's growing from the time of the Carolingian Renaissance up to particularly into the 13th century, which was really the corner, the knee of that exponential curve where it really started to take off. And the figures that I include in my narrative are Albert of Cologne, Robert Grosseteste, Thomas Aquinas, Roger Bacon, and I look at their contributions. If you go to the next slide,
the manuscripts, right? This is the kind of thing that we are starting to pay better attention to in medieval studies now. It's like it's not just so. Even thinking about what does the output of manuscripts mean? One, most of the manuscripts throughout the entire Middle Ages were, of course, for the liturgy, because that's what you write down, right? You need the text in order to perform the prayers and the processions and rituals and things like that accurately. And the other problem, of course, is like if you liturgical manuscripts are practical manuscripts. So one, they wear out. Two, they're updated, and three, therefore we don't know in fact how many manuscripts were made during this period. Two, because be replaced and stuff, just like the churches. And this I found in my visit in Rome was interesting. The Romans, because they were very poor for a lot of the Middle Ages, contrary to what you see from the 17th century palaces, they seem to have tended mainly to add on to the old buildings. So they'll have all these wonderful ancient and medieval mosaics that are then ornamented with Baroque and 19th century extra stuff that points to the beautiful ancient mosaics. In the north, they would tend to pull the whole building down and build a new one. So a lot of the cathedrals that we have, thinking about technologically, right, to build the great Gothic cathedrals took an enormous amount of craft knowledge and skills and stoneworking and glazing and architecture, therefore mathematics. I mean, the ignorance of claiming that there's no scientific progress when you're standing in front of Chartres is idiotic, right? And
it is idiotic, and I think the reason it's failing now is because people around the world can actually see it because of the internet. They can actually see these pictures,
right?
And they're like, "What dark? What?" Like you say, here's Chartres Cathedral. That's not the Dark Ages that did that.
And that's one of hundreds that were built in 10 or sorry, 12th and 13th centuries. And even Henry Adams visiting the electricity and magnetism, the dynamo exhibit in 1900 at the Paris Exposition, recognized, one, how much money it took to build all of those churches in the north, and two, how many of them there were. And he's like, this is an enormous output of skill and technology and such, and all of the science. I mean, the glass work. People like Grosseteste and Bacon. I'm not so sure about Albertus Magnus. I mean, but the Franciscans are, insofar as they're worrying about optics and light, they're worrying about ornament for the liturgy, right? But Albert is studying a lot of Aristotle and doing motions of animals and things like that. So I just don't know as much about him outside of his animal studies. That the sort of the 19th century love of the statistics is skewing all sorts of things. The other thing to think about is the more of these manuscripts you have, it means that other industries are also developing. For example, wool, right? The textile industries that are behind the fact that you have more animals to make books out of. Right?
Yeah.
That you have all this parchment production in order to make those books. Well, they use the rest of the animal too to make clothes, and bones to make ink, right? You char bones to make the so all of this stuff. It's like, it's so, and then of course it's all happening in cities that they're building. It's just fascinating to me that the 18th century can sit there on top of all of this development and be blind to it.
And I never even thought about that until you were mentioning all the parts of the animal they're using in all this industry. Is that the animal husbandry as a science, as a study, must have increased greatly in knowledge, because they needed a tremendous amount of healthy animals to do this. That's something I hadn't thought of before.
All of it.
Yeah.
And this is, so our specific studies on the pigments that Bucklow is pointing to, that I've done classes. This is why I've read Albertus Magnus, that we read some of his commentary on Aristotle's studies of animals, right? That the 13th century, now I've forgotten what I was thinking. Oh yes, the animal husbandry. Like, there's all sorts of other things, like commercial fish ponds. Rabbits in England are all imports. Like, they
Really?
didn't take off as badly as they did in Australia, but the Normans brought the rabbits over, and they're very fragile in the English climate, and they have to be taken care of in special warrens and things like that. So there's this this rise of these manuscripts is disguising all sorts of other. I mean, it's like the manuscripts are literally just the tip of the iceberg of the technology and industry that is developing during these centuries. So it's interesting to say, it's like, here, these guys, whether Bacon is making, studies of optics and rainbows and things like that. Yeah, on top of absolutely everything else that's going on in the period. Yeah.
Right. Well, the key story is looking at Albert of Cologne and his influence as a teacher, because, of course, he was the teacher for Thomas Aquinas, who had such a profound impact on, not just the Catholic Church, but Western thought in general, reintroducing Aristotle and adding logical rigor to analysis.
Well, so to be fair, Aquinas was sort of the tip of an iceberg on that one too. He's only able to do it because everybody else around him is also doing it.
It's a momentum, huh?
Yeah. And the recovery of Aristotle been going on since the 12th century. So, yeah.
Right. But it was interesting to me to read, and this is one of the things I wanted to put before you and get your feedback on. Reading the shorter Cambridge history of the shorter Cambridge medieval history, where it talks about how, I think it was in 1284, the Dominicans decided that you were not allowed to criticize or take issue with Aquinas any longer, and became more rigid and less open to dissension or creative thought. And really the baton got passed to the Franciscans, who up in Oxford and England were pursuing their studies with Roger Bacon, and then later people like William of Ockham.
hold that thought for a second. I got a question from John Abrisi. What's the truth of the situation got to do with an agenda driven by political and activist motivation? I'm not sure where that's coming from. What were we talking about? The truth driven by political and activist motivation. John, maybe you can explain a little bit further.
Yeah.
So yes, you asked me this, and this is one of these horrible. Oh my gosh. So scientists get to play this game all the time. It's like, well, you don't have enough background. I could never explain it to you. It's like Feynman famously explaining
She
why
got that
he
from me. I'll
couldn't
tell you later.
explain magnetism, right? That isn't that Feynman? And then he's talking about weak forces and strong forces, and then something falls. And he's like, weak but not negligible. I don't remember anyway. That explaining the problem of what's going on between the Franciscans and Dominicans, like, how much longer do we have? One of the things I've been realizing over my last year of study of the Franciscans is how little we've known about them properly. One, because the Franciscans, okay, so all sorts of things. Like, for example, that, so many of their books were lost in the Reformation, particularly in England, right? So you just don't have the present wiping out the memory of the past. It is a great way for the present to convince itself that it's smart. Right. And this Bucklow talks about this as well. It's like, he worked as a conservator, painting conservator in England, and so a lot of the objects that he's worked on have been English made. But the 16th century destroyed most of England's great medieval art. You look at some, sculptures on the cathedrals left and things like that, but the paintings are all gone, the statues are all gone. So all of this technical knowledge that fed into what we now think of as the Renaissance, right? One of the things Bucklow's looking at are some oil-painted retables, altar retables. Oil painting that is like 150 years before the Van Eycks are supposedly inventing it in the Netherlands. But we can't know that because it's all gone, right? Okay. So one, I think we haven't had people thinking about the materiality questions in the way that we're starting to now. I spent the last, several months thinking about how Bonaventure, particularly with his emphasis in the journey in the mind into God, it's the Itinerarium Mentis in Deum, it's the into God, right? Has some very interesting things to say about the importance of the physical world, the material created world, through mathematics, through up into the sort of more contemplative realms that we're more used to thinking about as theological. But Bonaventure himself, in this what's allegedly a contemplative prayer manual, is talking about how numbers are everything is in numbers. Which, okay, so if you've got like one of the major teachers in your order telling you that the great contemplation comes out of mathematics, you might be encouraged to do more mathematics, like Occam, right? So, our methods and purposes are not theirs, but their contemplative curiosity is much more incarnational than ours. Going back to, Hans, your own practice in saying we've misunderstood the electromagnetism because the engineers haven't been talking to the theoreticians.
That's familiar,
enough, right? It's so, again, and I think probably the history of science has been just as corrupted by this problem as the science itself has been, right? That I can't show you the work for the period that I work on that would help you answer the questions you have about what's happened in the 19th century, because the 19th century is the place that started all of the scholarship. So we've been, just like your Whewell guy, how you say it, right? Whewell, ignoring what was going on in the period that he says, oh, nothing happened then. And it's like, well, we can recognize now that there's all of this embodied mysteries. I mean, people love thinking the Masons are like behind everything, right? Well, they had craft skills for cutting stone that were true mysteries, right? Because you have to train in the use of all of the tools and everything. And you can't, I've seen movies of them training the carvers at St. John the Divine in New York, right? They had to like start their own stone carving school in order to build that church.
I remember that.
Right.
I remember that documentary. Yeah.
So I'd say, so what's his name, Shorter Cambridge Medieval History. He's writing in the early 20th century in the peak of this kind of scientific mythologizing. And therefore, I don't trust anything he says at that level. And also, it's just like 2 or 3 pages where he's making those claims. So I think it's, it's just as you're frustrated with the textbooks in your field, we have these narratives, we have these large-scale assumptions about what was going on. And right now, you're on the cutting edge in your own field. You're asking questions about things like, what kind of material science did they have? And we're just now figuring that out in my field for our things. So it's sort of like we're in step, but I think there's going to have to be a lot of correction across the whole like arc of the narrative that we've gotten wrong. And the 17th century is going to come out looking pretty silly, actually, because they just told themselves all sorts of lies about how clever they were.
But they did have cool fashion, did they not?
All right.
We were.
The
They looked cool doing it.
Are called that for a reason.
Now, I wanted to say something about what you were saying a minute ago. I think people conflate the word mystery with secret. And that's why when you say that the guilds were teaching the mysteries of carving stone, or,
Right.
the mysteries of making glass, it was, they weren't really secrets. They were kind of trade secrets, maybe in some cases, but it was just, like you said before, if you haven't gone to the classes and learned how to do it, then you're not going to know it. It's not intuitive.
Well, one thing that became clear as I re-examined the history in my discussion was, there are these lazy narratives we have, like, oh, nothing ever happened in the Middle Ages and it was all Dark Ages, and basically there's nothing to talk about between Archimedes and Galileo because nothing happened there, and then Galileo reinvented modern physics. So that's kind of the conventional wisdom. And I wanted to go at least one layer deeper and point out, well, there was actually some stuff going on in the Middle Ages, and here's a rough outline of what was happening. But it was very clear to me there were layer upon layer upon layer there, and I could write an entire book. And I had to do what I could and move on.
Well, we medievalists appreciate that you even acknowledge that it's there, right? But the thing is, what every guys, what Hans is doing for the electromagnetism story, recognize that it's happening. It's kind of exciting, right? It's happening across the disciplines right now. That there's maybe partly because of like how everything's available. Like Casey's saying that we can see photographs of more things. We've talked about this in our digital retrieving the medieval mode, right? That because of the internet, because of the ability to share information that we have now, like the 17th, I'm going to just harp on the 17th century because that's where we are in Act 4 and thinking about it. They were high on their ability to print books. And they had this idea that, if we can print it all and share out all this knowledge with these printed books, then, great things are going to happen. What Hans is working on for the 19th and early 20th centuries is, the electromagnetism version of things, as you're making radios, and you've been mentioning that, right? But now that we're here in this digital, we're suddenly everything's flipping again, right? And you're suddenly realizing that, that we're losing, because of our being in the digital, our embodied experience, but on the other hand, recovering other kinds of understanding. It's interesting.
Well, if you're in the 17th century, you can print lots of books, okay, but who decides what gets printed? It's the same question as who decides what gets allowed on the internet, right? Is it misinformation? Do we want to get that out of there, like this whole COVID mess, right? And it's maybe the same thing as were the St. Franciscans doing more than the Dominicans? Well, who, like you pointed out, in England, a lot of that information got wiped out. So who was deciding what information got passed on to the next generation? It's the same problem rearing its head over and over again in different ways.
Right.
Well, I know that, Professor, you are a big fan of Marshall McLuhan, but I'm really partial to his teacher, Harold Innis, who wrote Empire and Communication. And the insight that he had of taking communications and dividing them into two types, the space-like and time-like. The idea of time-like communication, communication that speaks through time, things like monuments and architecture that take the resources of a large central state or a large central organization to be able to pull off successfully and communicate its vision, versus space-like communication, things like the written word and being able to write on papyrus and later writing on printing to let you send lots of data very quickly. You have a lower barrier to entry. It's more conducive with a free exchange of ideas, where you don't need the resources to be able to hire your stonemasons to build your cathedral. And it's fascinating to me how the internet simultaneously combines both of those. And on the one hand, it is a means of communication that lends itself to centralization and totalitarian control and technocratic monitoring of everything that's going on. And on the other hand, it is still open and freewheeling, and people like us can get together on a Friday night and have a conversation about deep intellectual topics like this. I know, I wrote my first book 20 years ago, the Ultrawideband antenna book. And I had to go to the library and pour through the stacks and the old journal articles and so forth to get the research, the information that I needed in order to write that book. It is so much easier today between archive.org and other online sources of books. I can, particularly as I'm talking about what happened in the 18th and 19th century, virtually any book or any periodical that I see mentioned, I can usually track down in relatively short order and take a look at what was actually said without having to rely on second and third hand accounts. So it really is a wonderful time to do research, and it's really allowing for a decentralized amount of research. I mean, if I had to do this 20 years ago, I wouldn't be able to do it unless I spent a lot of time hitting up a half dozen different major university libraries. And now I can do it from my desk here at home.
And can we ever be sure that all of the information that you could want is going to be uploaded into the archive, right? We don't really know, but it's the same problem.
That's an issue. And increasingly, it's fascinating to see how artificial intelligence is very clearly going to be a tool to be an intermediary for you and to answer your questions instead of a classic search query. And we're already seeing things like the Gab AI being censored from Twitter because it was talking about details of the nationalization of German banks in 1933.
And it's competing with Grok, I'm sure.
We do. I think if we only had the poll of Tucker Carlson, we'd get Werner on here to talk about the banks. So I have there were two levels of things that I was thinking when Hans was talking. So one that it's skills and access are this twinned problem, right? One, yes, that 20 years ago, I'm right now I'm working on a syllabus for this autumn's campus class on studying medieval history, and one of the things I was doing this week was pulling stuff off the internet to have for the reading, and I was wanting to assign them some of the novels from the 19th century, like Victor Hugo and Walter Scott and things like that, gave us this image of the Middle Ages from, in fact, and they're from the 1830s, right? So they're before a lot of the scientific academic scholarship even gets off the ground. That in the 1830s, history is still a sort of it's a amateur practice. And I realized I could go to the online scans and find, obviously not the the first editions. I found some of those for sale right on the internet, but I can have them look at what a first edition would look like in the PDFs. And I'm saying, well, of course I'm going to do that rather than assign them a more recent printed version that would not have the same sort of effect of understanding. It's like, how did people originally visually encounter this book? On the flip side of that, though, you and I, Hans, are actually lucky that we were doing this 20, 30 years ago when we couldn't get it off of archive.org, because we know to look for it on archive.org, right? That you know that without our, and this is where I'm trying to think about how we have to, in scholarship and science and academia generally, explain the skills that we actually do command, which are mysteries in the sense of how to explain why I can search something on even Google, but I can put a question into the AI that gets a better answer than you can, random person out there, because I know what to ask, right? Those are my craft skills. Those are my embodied things because I've spent, years and years and years looking through all the books, right? So
Right.
on the, we're about to go through another sort of horrible moment like the 17th century. We'll all be like super stupid when we get out the other side because we'll have forgotten all of the things that went into making the moment possible in the first place.
Idiocracy is real in the future, right? We've got to try to avoid it.
Well, it's sort of worrying, right? Because we did the 17th century didn't. They came out the other side of it and convinced themselves that people in the Middle Ages hadn't known anything. Nitwits.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of that was them trying to change society as a whole. It was another year zero thing, year zero movement in scholarship.
Well, it's interesting. I like to put a header quote in front of each chapter to kind of capture the spirit of what I'm going to be talking about. One of the ones I picked was from Benjamin Franklin in a letter where he wrote, I agree with you that it is too much the spirit of our age to look down upon and ignore the wisdom of the ancients.
Good quote.
So, even back in the mid 18th century, Franklin was realizing there were a lot of people who were ignoring ancient wisdom and weren't paying attention to it or taking it into account in their studies and research.
He was a voracious reader, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the cautionary tales is don't rely on the chat bots. You've got to do it reading yourself, because otherwise you'll lose at the craft level the kinds of insights that we're talking about. It's like the only way Hans was able to write this book is because of his practical experience with the antennae, and I'm saying the only ways that I was able to write the kinds of things that I was describing with, say, prayer practice came out of my. By analogy, by my fencing practice, but that if we're not doing the practices that people had in the past, we'll lose the knowledge that they had. And it doesn't matter if you've abstracted it out and described in a book and, pointed to it. If you don't have that, my dog is running under the, what have you done, dog? He's agreeing with me. So he snorted some dust. That we train ourselves in understanding with the practices that we have as well, and this is must have this lesson, because otherwise science is going to turn into this usual. They've been priding themselves, scientists, maybe not engineers, priding themselves on being able to abstract knowledge out on the basis of experiment, but haven't been doing the experiments. The 17th century did some really insane experiments, but there you go.
Well, the interesting thing, and this is one of the things I emphasized in chapter 2 of my book, is just looking at the example of Isaac Newton, because Newton came to his mechanics and his universal law of gravitation through a lot of observational evidence. He had the benefit of all of Kepler's work. He had independent data sets on the moon's motion and on comets. And he noted that the acceleration of the moon for its distance seemed related to the acceleration of an apple dropping
they have gravity
to the Earth,
which is a good Aristotelian quality.
So if you read how he discovered his mechanics, it's very empirically and experimentally grounded and based. But a generation later, a lot of his French successors, well, Newton's laws are intuitively obvious axioms. They completely forgot the experimental process involved in deriving them in the first place, and instead they treated them as, well, that, just obvious axiomatic principles that then became the basis of their deductive conclusions, doing things like interpreting them through what's called the law of least action, and through what's called Lagrangian mechanics, which is another way a more abstract way of looking at mechanics and Newton's laws. So that same process of fundamental discoveries being made inductively, looking at data, coming up with principles, and then those principles being used deductively to work out consequences and understand, better ways to organize the details. That it's a repeating trend, and that's part of why I wanted to do the history,
Right.
to explain how it is we're in the situation we're in today, because it's very similar to what the situation as Faraday found it. When Faraday came to electromagnetism, he did not have the mathematical background to understand the prevalent action at a distance theories. And the action at distance theories of electricity and magnetism assume that something here can impact something over there without any intermediate process. That made no sense to Faraday. That was the shut up and calculate of the day. And Faraday came up with this intuitive idea of fields in the spaces between the charges and currents, giving rise to these effects. And that extremely fertile idea led to Maxwell and all of our understanding of electromagnetism. And that's a big part of what's missing in physics today. We've gone back to that action at distance, just treat it mathematically. Yes, it's confusing, but shut up and calculate approach. The same cul-de-sac that we were in the 1820s and 1830s before Faraday came along. So understanding how that history repeats itself is an essential step to making progress today.
So, John and Brucey explained again. So the rhetoric is made to fit the political activist objective. I still don't know what he was responding to when we were talking about, but it occurs to me that the problem. I mean, and I think sort of implicitly, possibly, you're suggesting here, maybe if I'm going to get you in trouble on this, the scientists today are too snobs, and you're not. I mean,
Well,
so one. I thinking about Stevenson. He uses Newton a lot in his story in Baroque Cycle, and Newton's blowing up things constantly and sticking needles in his eye to see how his eyeball's distorted and so forth. That that we take this knowledge that is somehow acquired in this messy and embarrassingly physical way, and then say, oh, that's this contemplative truth that we don't have to get our hands dirty with anymore. And that the more in the history of all of these practices we study, the more you realize that people were doing things that one of the things we studied about the colors is the man doing the experiments with the microscope, Leeuwenhoek, was embarrassingly working class. I think that's right. That's Leeuwenhoek, right? That he's.
It's a Dutch name,
that.
Leeuwenhoek,
and
or something
that
like. Yeah.
There's somebody else who's making microscopes at the same time who's more prestigious and has the right. It's Hook, Hook, right, with his microscopes,
Micrographia. Yeah.
But that Leeuwenhoek had better lenses because he has the craft skills to be able to make them.
Well, it's interesting. A lot of the fundamental work, in fact, the discovery of electric currents is from, I'm trying to remember, I guess he was a dyer, Stephen Gray, who was kind of a skilled tradesman, but not anywhere near upper class. And after a career in the hard, physical, exposed to harsh chemical work of being a dyer, he simply couldn't work anymore and went to a retirement home. and while at the retirement home, did all these experiments and caught the attention of noble patrons, and was able to demonstrate transmitting electric effects along wires great distances, and basically discovered the concept of an electric circuit, an electric current.
So basically what we're saying is, guys, if you leave the robots to do all of your work, you'll never learn anything.
Well, you'll learn stuff, but you won't learn
Right.
anything new, because it's having the benefit of that new and original context that really gives you an edge up if you want to discover something interesting. I mean, there aren't many people who have simultaneously done theoretical physics and designed antennas and done serious work in near field electromagnetics, which is my background. And that particular unique context and skill set that I've developed is what's given me the examples from which I have been able to abstract away and induce the principles that I'm sharing in my books.
The thing is, you say things and I keep thinking of 18 new things to say, and then I forget 19 of them. Going back to the Newton, right? Here's another fun fact though, right? So the degree to which we think, we have true knowledge because of, the scientific description of things that we get out of these, proper experiments and such. How many colors does a rainbow have?
Oh, isn't it 7 if you
Why?
include indigo? Newton said so.
Why did Newton say so? This was in a footnote in Bucklow, so he's like, it's great, right? Why does it have 7? Know. So to help appreciate this, like in medieval paintings, you'll see rainbows have like 3 colors. They'll have red, a band of kind of white in the middle, the blending between the red and green, right? So there'll be red, white, and green, and that's the colors of the rainbow, which has to do with the way in which they understood the relationship between red and green. And apparently, I'm picking up on this, that the reason we have red and green for Christmas is because the Victorians were paying enough attention to the medieval, like, color systems that they at least picked up on the fact that red and green go together. But again, Bucklow talks through, this is in the riddle of the image, all of the ways in which red and green are actually also Venus and Mercury, because Venus comes from copper with verdigris, green comes from copper, verdigris, and red is rust from Mars, and so Venus and Mars from copper and iron, and that you have all of these relationships, and therefore red and green have to do with the relationship between heaven and earth. Shorthand version. Why does Newton come up with 7 colors then, if the previous tradition had depicted them as having just the 2 with the mixing in the middle?
Was he looking through a prism?
Probably the mystical alchemical significance of the number 7.
That's the number of the planets.
But the other,
so he needed it to be 7 because he was mapping it onto another symbolic structure, and therefore, the number of times it's like, how many crayon colors do you have? So you have the 7, the 7 colors of the rainbow. It's like scientifically true because Newton said so. It's like, yeah, because he was like looking for the symbolic, celestial significance of the colors.
Well, you've read the scholarship about how the Greeks didn't have blue.
I've heard of it, but I'm. They certainly had
if you
lapis,
read Homer,
right? They were making paint colors out of it.
He talks about like the wine dark sea, and the fact that descriptions of blue as a distinct color come relatively late. I don't know if that was Roman or even into medieval time before blue was kind of a distinctive color that comes up in
I'm suspicious of this because they were making their one, lapis is used in Egyptian antiquity.
Yeah.
You know why eyeshadow is blue? You have to have blue eyeshadow. You know why? Because lapis, the stone that they used to make these very expensive pigments, was considered to be good for your eyes. It's like medicine. So the blue eyeshadow, right? It's like it's clarifying for your eyes. So they do have that, and then the idols, the statues that they have in the temples in the ancient Near East also have blue eyes.
Well, I think the point is not that there weren't blue things or that they had blue in their art, but they did not have a concept for the color blue to distinguish it from just, dark or
Yeah,
But I
that's
mean,
that's one of
I
those
mean,
folk truths that I need to like figure out,
I mean,
hunt
the
down a bit.
sky,
Yeah.
I mean, the ocean on a sunny day, I mean, they're all very bright blue. So how could they lack the concept of blue?
Well, now Aquinas apparently says
well,
that
that
the
that's
ocean has several different colors, right? So it's
Well, it
green,
can
it could be
be.
green, it
Yeah.
could, yeah. And okay, this is the other layer of the color stuff, which is wonderful. That the reason we're interested in Leeuwenhoek's studies of the microscope is because he ends up being able to identify cochineal, the bugs that are used for the red dye that makes the Spanish Empire wealthy, were bugs because he was able to make good enough lenses to actually see the animals rather than see them as little like seeds or something. So there's a big debate whether or not they're bugs or seeds. But, and this is another Bucklow insight, right? Once you put things under the microscope, you can't deal with color anymore. So it's like because of these fancy optical instruments, telescopes and microscopes, you lose information. In fact, color is a part of our experience, and it is real in ways that one of my colleagues, Michael Rossi, works on the science of color, and in fact, modern color science is still very volatile because how to explain it, what it is, but it's there. We need it. We need it in all of our fashion and home furnishings and beauty products and things like that. And yet, it's a very it's color has proven extremely challenging to how do you say it, systematize.
we'll have to compare notes. There's some interesting research on how vision works. With the red, green, and bluish
Right.
receptors and how they allow us to distinguish between different colors. And there's some interesting anomalies that pop up just because of the distinctive nature of the trinary vision system that we have, and that I guess some creatures have 4 separate color sensors.
Birds see colors we can't. Yeah.
Yeah.
All this now see all of this presumably comes into your problem with the electromagnetic. It's light, right?
I don't get into color much. I mean, I talk a little bit about the work in optics. This is something that doesn't come up until book 3 when I do a review of light and optics. But there were 2 main theories of light. Huygens advanced the wave theory of light. Christian Huygens, famous Dutch physicist and astronomer, and Newton. Newton first came to fame as a scientist because of his optical work. His first major contribution to science was the development of the reflector antenna. Before Newton, people were using refractor antennas, so all the light had to pass through 2 separate lenses to be focused. With a reflector antenna, it's bouncing off of a curved mirror, and what's more, it's traversing the telescope tube twice, so you can get a smaller telescope for an equivalent amount of focal power, and that was Newton's contribution. But Newton's view of light, he was very careful to speak in generalities and to avoid ascribing specific physical mechanisms. But it's pretty clear when he was talking about rays, he thought light was physical particles moving in trajectories. But at the same time, he realized that it had fits of easy and difficult propagation that were effectively wave-like. And by measuring them, he actually measured correctly the wavelengths of different colored light, even though he did not have a wave theory of light. So it's fascinating seeing how much he accomplished in his optics for having a ray or particle-based theory. And in fact, Newton's theory of optics really anticipates the modern theory of light as being simultaneously particle and wave, because effectively Newton's theory of light was particles with wave-like properties.
Okay, so we come back around. Um, one of the things I've been thinking about, again, I'm just going to rely on Bucklow because he's my closest to being scientist right now, talking about these coincidence of opposites, that things can be. So, for example, like what color are leaves? Well, they're green. Well, in the fall they're red, right? So that thing, red and green are associated that way as well in the leaves. That in medieval understanding, there's often a recognition that things can be two opposites. I mean, for example, this, oh God, there's so many great things. You guys got to read his books. The words for black and white are the same in Middle English. That black is black and black. Bleach, right? You always say bleach is turning something white, but black is black. There, and sometimes you can only tell what they. And it's clearly it's two different colors. And what's interesting is white, as we said, comes from black lead being buried in urine and dung for, and I think there's another thing you have to add, for amount of time so that the white comes out of the lead and you end up with lead white, right? So white comes from black, and then, for example, silver, which is, when polished very white and bright, will tarnish and become black. Having things that are both and
Yeah.
is actually standard in medieval thinking, whereas now it seems we find these things more problematic.
Well, I mean, what you're describing sounds an awful lot like Niels Bohr's idea of complementarity in quantum mechanics, that you can have something be two things at once. That was his explanation for the paradox of particle and wave behavior. So that's kind of similar. Now, the lead, is that like a lead oxide turning
they
as a
bury
white pigment,
actual sheets of lead in the dung and piss on it. and then the white, you end up with white, and he has a picture in the book of this white coming off of the lead, and that's how you'd make the paint. Yeah, the pigment.
Okay.
The pigment is actually from this. Yeah, I read about how he described the process, but it's these. I've slammed together too many things. I was also reading about Nicholas of Cusa, who apparently was very interested in this kind of coincidence of opposites, and apparently he was read by some of these more recent mathematicians because he also did a lot of thinking on some of these mathematical transformations. Modern science is mysticism.
I was just.
I think my friend John Place, who runs the Fiat Lux Substack, may have talked about that. I'll have to track that.
You can see
down.
the mysticism in it. Christ is God and man, right? He's this and that. So you can see the influence on alchemy.
Right, but the thing is that they're used to physical properties having this characteristic, and being able to know things like, if you need to make this color, it comes out of this other color, which in our version of things, black and white are opposites, but they're like the two sides of the same coin opposite, not the unrelated differences.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's that fundamental alchemical principle, which is on slide 14,
I'll go back to the slides.
Of dissolve and combine, that I think may have its origin in some of Robert Grosseteste's writings on the two-step scientific method of breaking things down and then putting it back together to create a new understanding.
Yes, you say that compared to the alchemical model, solve et coagula, dissolve and combine. Yes, the alchemical. So one of the interesting things that came up in Werner's discussion with Carlson about Germany and they have so many different principalities, 355 or something, like some ridiculous number that you have of little polities in the Holy Roman Empire, and they all need gold. So you end up with alchemists everywhere, which transforms Germany into the great chemical powerhouse that it is. Right. Well, is it still to this day, right? That because of all this practice that they do with the materials, become very, very important for modern chemistry. There's more in alchemy than you think, because they never. Well, okay, I've gone off topic. It's all mystical. So why is your mysticism better than the particle and wave mysticism? Ha ha! I warned you.
Because the conventional wisdom of treating them as one thing breaks down when you start to take a look at a variety of different physical problems. I mean, if you like, I can share my doctoral research with you, which was the first time I ran into this problem, on something called an exponentially decaying dipole. It's like having a charged capacitor. If you put a voltage across a capacitor and then you put a resistor across the capacitor, it starts to discharge. And the mathematical function that describes the rate of discharge is it's an exponential decay. So it starts off discharging very quickly, but as you've reduced the charge across the capacitor, there's less voltage to move the current, and so you get less and less and less current as it discharges. Well, I wanted to understand how radiation works and how the energy that was in the static fields around this charged capacitor would decouple and radiate away. So I studied that problem, and I discovered that if you took a look at the magnetic fields around it, you have, by the right-hand rule, you have your induction fields going one way, because of the current that's aligned with your thumb. But the radiation magnetic field, which dominates further away, depends on the change in the current, which is going the other direction. So the radiation magnetic fields are going in the opposite direction. They're stronger further away. Well, in between there is a boundary where the fields are equal and opposite, and the net field is zero. And it turns out that this exponential decay is surrounded by a spherical surface where the magnetic field goes to zero. Well, if the magnetic field goes to zero, there is no energy going through that surface. You have to have E cross H. You have to have a cross product of electric and magnetic field in order to give rise to power transfer. So there's this bubble whose radius is the speed of light times the time constant around the decay, through which no energy passes. And yet it radiates into the far field. And if you take a look at how much radiation energy there is, it's the same amount of energy that was stored in the static fields outside the bubble. So what's happening is inside the bubble, energy is getting sucked into the decaying dipole or the discharging capacitor, and the radiation fields are pushing their way out through that influx of energy. And it's only once they get outside of the bubble that they pick up the energy that was in the static fields and guide it off and radiate away. So, that much more complicated picture really defies the conventional wisdom of, oh, those wiggling charges had to emit the energy from the origin. So that's an example of a physical system where conventional wisdom, where you would think an accelerating charge emits a photon, just does not work. And you have to take a look at the kind of fields and energy approach to understand what's going on.
So does the particle and wave work for anything?
Oh, it works for a lot of different examples. In fact, it's kind of hard to find good, clear examples of where it breaks down. It's a very good theory, and that's why people have largely accepted it uncritically. But I've got a good dozen different examples of where that does break down, and it gets very difficult to interpret things in terms of the accelerating charges radiating photons and photons not interacting with anything kind of model that's generally accepted today.
My inclination is to try to figure out the McLuhan version of how does having these different models change reality.
Well, I can give you an example, because one of the fundamental principles of both science and engineering is the concept of superposition. Reality is a very complicated place. The old question of how do you eat an elephant? And the answer is one byte at a time. What superposition lets us do is take all the complicated things that are going around us in reality, and because a lot of them are what we would call a linear system, we can break them down into their components and take a look at just one part. That whole is the sum of its parts, and we consider that small part individually and analyze it. So, for instance, as an antenna engineer, if I take my cell phone and I want to understand what my cell phone is doing, I would say, okay, my cell phone is radiating a signal, and maybe I have one path going directly to the antenna tower, and I have another path where it's bouncing off the ground and then going to the antenna tower. And in most problems like that, you add up, at most a half dozen different paths and look at the different distances and phasing and how they might be interacting as they reflect, add them up, and you solve the problem of what are the fields at the cell phone tower, and you're done. You've solved the problem. You move on to the next problem. But what everyone tends to forget, in the excitement of having solved that problem, is how to go back the other direction. Because just as the whole is the sum of the parts is the whole. And if we want to understand the whole, we have to take a look at everything else that's going on in addition to that cell phone problem that we've just solved. And when you do that, there's a whole world of different effects that are overlooked and ignored that suddenly come into view. For instance, if we are outside on a sunny day, we've got just over a kilowatt of energy per square meter beaming down from the sun. And we have, if the ground is in thermal equilibrium, there's another kilowatt per square meter of infrared radiation radiating its way back up. And when you consider the cell phone, it's radiating 800 milliwatts of power, a really small amount of power compared to all the huge flux from the sun and from the thermal radiation, let alone all the other radio signals that are out there. So what's really happening is when the cell phone radiates a signal, it's a little tiny signal, the energy the cell phone radiates immediately gets swept away by the vastly larger flows of energy in the environment. And that little cell phone signal ripples through, making subtle perturbations one way or the other of all the larger flows of energy in the environment until it reaches the cell phone tower and nudges some of the local energy that it happens to find into the cell phone tower. So if you look at the big picture, none of the energy actually from the cell phone makes it to the tower, but the same amount of energy that left the cell phone arrives at the tower. It's a completely different picture of taking a look at what's going on, taking that holistic view of putting everything together and of recognizing that there's really just one field and one energy flow taking place, instead of our usual practice, which is to break everything down into its parts and never put them back together again.
Mystic confirmed. Yes.
Yeah. Right.
We have St. Martin 7773. Heisenberg Gifford lecture. Heavily mathematized theories at nanoscales are first received by the senses, interpreting instruments, and the theory has to be translated into common language. Some things can be sensed only by one sense, proper sensibles, other by more than one, common sensibles. Do you know who this is? Examples of the first are color, sound, smell, and taste. Examples of the second are shape, number, motion, etc. Heisenberg knew who was working in a modern tradition that wanted to put the common sensible first and make math's first philosophy. Math abstracts from change, abstracts from reality, what might be opposed in the mind but aren't in reality. The art of science experiences the deliberate excluding of variables in order to see one particular dimension of a nature.
Yeah, focusing on a particular aspect. Heisenberg plays a really critical role in my opinion, of how physics got off track. Basically, there was a philosophy that as it matured, came to be called positivism, that was pioneered by Ernst Mach. And Mach thought that as scientists, we needed to look just at observables and refrain from vain, empty metaphysical speculations about what's really going on. So he thought atoms were a fine way to organize the observations we make, but they had nothing to do with what was going on in reality. He didn't believe atoms existed. It was just a mental shorthand for doing chemical calculations. Well, Einstein was deeply influenced by Mach. So when Einstein came to special relativity, he focused on observables, and special relativity looked at the fact that an observer observes the speed of light being the same in every inertial reference frame, and that the laws of physics are the same in each inertial reference frame. He focused on what that observer would observe. Well, by the time he got to generalize relativity so that it would cover accelerations and have a law to describe gravity, and he made the theory of general relativity, Einstein was beginning to backpedal a bit from that Machian positivist emphasis on observation, because the theory of general relativity, basically in the description that I really like of it by John Wheeler, that matter and energy tell space-time how to curve, and then space-time tells matter how to move. Well, if you're talking about space having this property of curvature that governs the motion of the things moving through it, well, that kind of smacks of the kind of ether that when Einstein was doing special relativity, he dismissed as being a vain metaphysical hypothesis that you don't need ether, you just do the math. We only focus on what's observed, not on these hypothetical mechanisms that might be behind it. Well, as he got into general relativity, he moved away from that. And he was starting to think of space as actually having properties like curvature, making things move. Now, that was, he came up with general relativity, like I think in 1917 or 1915 or so. And when quantum mechanics came out in the 1920s, Heisenberg came to Berlin and gave his lecture on his quantum mechanical theory. And Einstein invited Heisenberg back to his apartment. Now, we only have Heisenberg's word on what happened, and he wrote about this in a book, Physics and Beyond, that came out in, I think, 1971. So, Einstein was already dead for almost 15 years, more than 15 years at that point. But what Heisenberg said is that Einstein invited him back to Einstein's apartment, and Einstein asked him, so where are the electron trajectories in this theory of yours, Heisenberg? And Heisenberg said, there aren't any. We're focusing just on what the observer is observing, and we don't worry about things like the trajectories of where the electrons are going. And when Einstein said, well, that didn't make a lot of sense to him, Heisenberg quoted Einstein back to Einstein, explaining all of the work that Einstein did on focusing on observables and what Einstein said about the importance of focusing only on what the observer is observing and not on the vain metaphysical speculations. And Einstein's reaction was he was taken aback by that. And he said that, or Heisenberg said, Einstein's reply was, well, maybe I did say such a thing and even write such a thing down, but it's all nonsense just the same.
Okay, then.
And that was really the transition point for Einstein, because in all the discussions on quantum mechanics, Einstein became he was always the champion of physical reality, of God not playing dice with the universe. And that came to fruition in a paper that he wrote with Podolsky and Rosen in 1935. Came to be known as the EPR paper after the initials of the authors, where he and his co-authors argued that quantum mechanics had hidden variables and had to be incomplete. And it turns out that is the single most quoted and cited paper that Einstein ever wrote. And it's really key to understanding some of the problems with quantum mechanics. But unfortunately, Einstein did not prevail in that debate at the time because of Niels Bohr and his advocacy of the Copenhagen interpretation, which was a pure focus on the observables and an argument that the observer makes the measurement through the act of observation. So the waveform doesn't collapse until it has been measured. The cat is both alive and dead in the box until you open it up to see if the radioactive particle decayed and opened up the poison vial and killed the cat. I mean, what's ironic about that is that example was made up by Schrodinger as a reductio ad absurdum to show how silly the Copenhagen interpretation was, and everyone took it as, oh yeah, that's exactly what happens. The cat's both alive and dead in a superposition of the two states until you open up the box and collapse the waveform and you force it to collapse into one of the two.
They were getting dangerously
states.
close to going outside of their field into the land of philosophy with that one, I think, weren't they?
Well, it's fascinating. The Nobel Prize winning particle physicist Murray Gell-Mann said that Niels Bohr brainwashed a generation of physicists. And that's really the case. My mentor, or one of my mentors in graduate school, was a physicist named John Wheeler, who studied under Bohr, who did a lot of fundamental work on quantum measurement. He was a big advocate of that observables first approach. He coined the term "it from bit," that somehow information was more fundamental and important than reality itself. And one day I had a chance to talk with him about this. I had been confused by quantum mechanics, and I had just discovered this pilot wave approach that made so much more sense because it talked about hidden variables, the particles actually moving under the influence of this pilot wave. And it made a lot more sense of a causal, locally real approach to quantum mechanics. So I asked him, Professor Wheeler, what do you think of this pilot wave approach to quantum mechanics? And he said, the screwdriver theory of quantum mechanics. And that was a little vague, but I kind of got what he was talking about because I'd read criticisms of it as being a mechanistic scaffolding that the physicists who are incapable of grasping the profound significance of the Copenhagen interpretation insist on having to try to preserve causality. I mean, that's basically the criticism people had of it. So I knew he'd written a lot of books on quantum measurement theory, and I asked him, so where can I go to read more about your writing on the subject of pilot wave theory so I can understand your objections to it? And he looked away, and then he looked back at me and he said, I really ought to look into that sometime so I can know what's wrong with it.
Wow.
It was just physicists had that preconception that Bohr worked everything out. What else is there to do? And if you're in contradiction with what Bohr said, like de Broglie and Bohm were with their pilot wave approach, well, clearly that has to be wrong. And if I took 20 minutes someday and opened it up, I'm sure I could prove that very easily. I just don't have time to do that today. And too many of them never took the time to really seriously look at it. And sadly, that included Professor Wheeler too.
This is the lesson for tonight. The framing of our knowledge is a condition of our ability to see anything, which is a good medieval understanding too, and one we've actually dealt with. We've talked about all these about frames and how you frame things, and that we here on the Mosaic Ark are trying to help everyone reframe how we tell the story about the adventure that we're on. So the moment has come to see things newly. That's a good thing. It's a good thing. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, we've bewildered everybody, including Hans, enough to say, can you? I have the final slides in your. Whoops, go here. The final slides in your stack.
I know better than to expect you're going to go through any significant number of my slides.
There were so many of them. I had to put them in 4 sets because they.
Well, you've got the important ones right there.
Okay, here we go. So, Hans has actually told all of this in other forms. His art and science of ultra-wideband antennas, he's promised that's his craft secrets, his actual mysteries. So, this fields and energy thing is like, merely for contemplatives. If you really actually want to build them, right, you go to your ultra-wideband book. If you want to know how, in fact, everyone's been telling you the wrong story, the hidden truth, which I think I said this last time we talked. It's like when I'm reading Hans's novels, I'm convinced that everything he's describing actually happened. The blend of history and probability is quite delicious. And The Wise of Heart, which we won't talk about because it'll get us in trouble and canceled. Every time Hans shows up with Wise of Heart, he gets canceled off of Kickstarter.
Will it anymore?
What?
Will it anymore? I don't know. Is the tide turning a bit?
Okay,
anyway.
that's another. Well, we have to
That's
come
another
back
topic.
on for a different layer of topic. The present book is Fields and Energy, which you can find now available to participate in the crowdfund at Some Fund My Comic, right?
Fund
He's got
My
the
Comics.
mug. And
I had to use
very
that
good.
mug today.
The Fund My
since we were
Comic.
gonna
And
do
of course, if you participate in the funding, you get all sorts of great merch possibilities of what magnets and pins and magnets. Of course, you have to have magnets.
I had to have magnets, but yeah, I have a collection of SPQR merch that you can get, mouse pads and stickers and pens and all kinds of cool stuff. In fact, if you get the signed copies of the books, I throw in an SPQR pen also in the.
So I will say, having made you pay attention to the logo at the beginning, it is a delightful logo. Your energy eagle with the what do you do if you relabel the acronym, but what is it called? What would that be? It's like alchemical transformation, the SPQR, into the Society for the Study of Post-Quantum Research. And here's
I'm not sure.
What would that be called, right? It's like a
repurposing the acronym or refashioning it.
I'm sure there's a medieval term for it. You can find more
Dissolve
about Hans out on his Ether stream, t.me Telegram channel. He hangs out with us in there, and also on his Substack.
And in fact, you'll find the contents of the book on the Substack. In fact, most of book 2 is already up on the Substack. I have a little more to do a book 2. I mean, the whole thing was going to be one book, and then it just started.
You're writing
growing.
Fantasy, aren't you? It's turned into a trilogy.
Yeah.
Well, it grew to the point where I knew I was going to have to split it in 2, and then I got into section 5.2 on relativity, which was just 3 simple pages summarizing relativity and Einstein before I could get on to the main event of quantum mechanics, which is what I really wanted to discuss. And at last count, that 3-page section has about 150 pages now. That's what I've been working on mostly for the last year. And between everything else that was in chapter 5 has now become book 2. And book 3 will be what was the original chapters 6 through 10, assuming that doesn't expand. You might be getting 4 books.
Hans has learned what it's like writing history,
3.
which he has practiced on from his training too. But yes, it's like you can see. Okay, so this is a nice lesson. You see this phenomenon from a distance, and you think, aha, I now get it, right? It's like I could say I understand what happened in the 17th century, but to actually unpack it all and explain it and turn it into a narrative, there is no shorter version. History's like that. You get down into it and you realize the big picture is correct, but you need the details, and your eating the elephant problem recurs a lot. So there we go. We say St. Martin 17773. There's an extra 7 in there. It says, I didn't know Hans's Twitter handle. The Ethers are. Thank you for introducing Hans. I hadn't known about him. You have a new fan.
Oh, pleasure to meet you, St. Martin.
Well, thank you so much for coming to play with us on the Ark. We ladies are going to turn it into mysticism no matter what. We can do that with the mere turn of a screw. Um,
It's witchcraft.
it's we're the witches if you're the wizard, and I'm still waiting for like exactly how this new understanding is going to make the wizards like break open the universe and blow us all up, because that's all they do,
No, I
right?
was wondering how it was going to affect the production of nuclear energy as you were describing it. But
Hans is being very
uh,
close. Well, they'll get to contemplate. Yeah. And the banks. Yeah. We know there's got to be a secret in there. And Silent Draco has been hanging out talking about how things that happen when it becomes nothing but management cost controls. For example, at NASA, no engineers. We are happy that Hans is still being an engineer, even as he's gone into storytelling and history. I think it's all going to fold into one, and we are in the grand revelation that Bonaventure pointed us to of the way in which numbers point us to the mind, to be in the mind in God. So there, how's that? They're stunned
I'm
at
sorry.
the startling ability of Professor Fulton Brown to turn everything into something about the Franciscans. Yes.
Well, I was actually muting the electromagnetic activity outside my window. Big thunderstorms.
Well, with that thought, everybody, we are trying to get the channel into a little bit more user-friendly space. It will never be completely user-friendly because that's who we are. But to help you all navigate along with our arc, playlists are coming that will help you sort of subset and stack and think about all of the wonderful things that we are here to show you on our cruises. Welcome to season 4, and we promise it's going to be what kind of year? This is we're gonna take you places you've only seen in dreams. Good night, everybody.